Good day, everyone, and welcome to the PAHAYAG election report by PUBLiCUS Asia Incorporated. I'm Aureli Sinsuat, Executive Director of PUBLiCUS, and I will be reporting the results of our first National Election Tracker Survey. This survey is part of our PAHAYAG 2022 Election Survey Series, which aims to provide the general public with up-to-date information on the state of the race for President, Vice President, and Senator as we approach Election Day on May 9, 2022. Between February 11 to 16, 2022, we asked 1,500 registered Filipino voters to provide insights on their voting preference and general sentiments on the May 2022 elections. The members of our National Purposive Survey Panel were randomly selected from the online research panel marketplace of 200,000 Filipinos maintained by the Singapore office of US-based Pure Spectrum, based on parameters set from official COMELEC statistics on registered voters. For more information on the panel sample of the survey, you can click on the link to the survey's executive summary in the description of this video. To keep up to date with the latest news on the 2022 elections, please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe buttons below on this video. Now, onto the results. During the February 11 to 16 survey, former Senator Bongbong Marcos maintained his lead in the presidential race. 52% of respondents said they would vote for Marcos to become the next president of the Philippines. Incumbent Vice President Leni Robredo also maintained her distant but secure second-place standing with 22% of the vote. Coming in third place is Manila Mayor Isko Moreno Domagoso with almost 9% of the votes. 9% of voters also said they were undecided about who to vote for president in the coming election. Rounding out the top six were Senator Ping Lacson with just over 3% of the vote, followed by Senator Manny Pacquiao with 2.6% of the vote, and labor rights activist Calio de Guzman with less than 1%. For Vice President, Davao City Mayor Inday Sara Duterte was the top choice among respondents with 54% of the vote. The battle for second to fourth place in the vice presidential race was close. Senator Kiko Pangilinan came in second place with 13.67% of the vote, followed by Doc Willie Ong with 12.6%, and Senate President Tito Soto with 9.2% of the vote. Almost 9% of respondents were undecided about their vice presidential vote. Congressman Lito Atienza rounded out the top six with only a little over 1% of the vote. Now, onto the Senate race. The Magic 12 of our Feb 11 to 16 survey includes 5 incumbent senators, 3 returning senators, and 4 new faces. Incumbent Sorsogon Governor Chiz Escudero was the top choice among respondents for senator, with 50.7% of the vote. He was followed by Taguig Representative Alan Peter Cayetano with 43.5% of the vote, and Senator Win Gatchalian with 40.3%. Newcomers Raffy Tulfo and Mark Villar came in 4th and 5th place with 37.3% and 34.7% of the vote, respectively. They were followed closely by Senate Majority Leader Mig Subiri, who earned 34.5% of the vote, and Antique Representative Lauren Lagarda with 34.3%. Completing the Magic 12 were Senator Risa Hontiveros at 31.3%, Attorney Chel Diokno at 26.1%, Senator Joel Villanueva at 25.9%, Senator Richard Gordon at 25%, and former Defense Secretary Gibo Teodoro at 24.1%. Actor Robin Padilla came in 13th place, followed by former Senator J.V. Ejercito, former Quezon City Mayor Herbert Bautista, former Vice President Jojo Binay, Larry Gadon, former Senator Gringo Honasan, and former Senator Jinggoy Estrada. Former presidential spokesperson Harry Roque came in 20th place. Joining us now is the Chief Data Scientist of PUBLiCUS Asia Incorporated, Dr. David Barua Yap Jr., to provide some additional insights on our survey. Hi, David. Good afternoon.
Hi, Aureli. Good afternoon.
First, David, could you tell us a little bit more about the composition of our survey panel?
So, based on the demographic statistics generated from the sample, a strong argument can be made that the sample is predominantly young, middle class, highly educated, and steeped in social media. First off, around 60% of the sample is comprised of registered voters aged 18 to 39, with around 40% of the respondents aged 18 to 29. Around 60% of the sample is comprised of respondents who indicated average household incomes that fall into the middle income brackets, with an additional 7% of respondents who indicated average household incomes that place them in either the upper income or rich brackets. Additionally, over half of the sample is comprised of respondents who indicated that they are college graduates. Moreover, around 80% of the sample have at least reached the college level of education. It is also worth noting that smartphone access and overall social media usage rates across the sample can be viewed to be high. Close to 90% use smartphones, while usage rates of platforms such as Facebook and YouTube are more or less near universal. Usage rates of platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok are also considerable.
So if you could give like a simple profile of who our respondents are in just maybe a sentence, what could you say?
So going back to what I just said, based on the demographic statistics, these would be the people who tend to spend a lot of time in social media, which means that they actually have the time to spend on social media, which means that they have, which suggests that they would have a certain level of disposable income. So these are the people who get a lot of inputs from social media, from mainstream news. These are the people who try to get as much information as possible. These are likely the people who are most steeped in the ecosystem created by the upcoming elections. So in a way, we can say that this sample or what we're looking at in the Pahayag tracker are the people who have access to the highest level of information, to the most amount of information when it comes to the elections.
So in a nutshell, we could say that these are the people who are really quite engaged in this ongoing election campaign, right?
Correct. One can make that argument. These are the people who spend a lot of time on social media. These are the people who have the time to engage in social media activities pertaining to elections.
Okay. So let's move on to our results. David, what can you tell me about the state of the race for president?
There is little movement, if any, in our presidential polls coming from our December 2021 baseline figures. Bongbong Marcos retains his lead with a 52.3 preference share. Lenny Robredo remains at second place at 22.3%. Isko Domagoso is at third place at 8.9%. Other candidates are below the 5% mark, at least insofar as our sample is concerned. Now, while some may be tempted to point out changes from one period to another to infer some level of discernible activity in the presidential race, it is important to remember that this is a sample of 1,500 respondents. This translates to a margin of error of around 3%. With that said, none of the candidates registered increases or decreases past this 3% threshold. This in itself is a result worth emphasizing. This suggests that the needle, so to speak, has not moved over the past 2 months. This is interesting given that there have been many developments over the past months that many would have expected to elicit some movement in the polls. These include Typhoon Odette relief operations, the controversy surrounding the disqualification cases, as well as the brouhaha raised over attendance in interviews of various media outfits and personalities.
So if there's no change in the needle at this point, David, what can you see from the data about maybe potential inflection points or causes of concern for former Senator Marcos going forward in his campaign?
Well, if we take a broader view of the statistics and look at other surveys released by other reputable survey outfits, what we can infer, at least at this point in time, is that there is some level of divergence when it comes to support for former Senator Bongbong Marcos. If you look at Pulse, for example, he went up to 60%. We did not capture any kind of increase of that magnitude from December to February. And if we consider the composition of our sample, then we can be led to infer that increases in former Senator Bongbong Marcos' polling numbers could be largely attributed in gains in socioeconomic classes outside classes A, B, and C, or predominantly DE.
Okay. That's very interesting, David. So I guess in the same vein, how would we explain Vice President Robredo's generally good numbers in our survey compared to maybe other surveys?
That could be attributed to her relatively higher levels of popularity among those in classes A, B, and C. If you consider the differences between our survey results and those of, say, Pulse and Lilo, where her numbers are below 20%, then going back to the composition of the sample, it is in the socioeconomic classes that's where the difference, the key or crucial difference lies.
So, aside from former Senator Marcos and the vice president, did you see anything of note with the other presidential candidates whose campaigns have not really gotten so much traction so far?
Well, basing my observations solely on what we have from the Pahayag tracker and our Pahayag Quarter 4 survey late last year, uh, as I said earlier, there is no discernible movement, at least insofar as the numbers are concerned. Manila Mayor Isko Dumagosa is still sub 10%. Uh, Ping Lacson is still below 5%, and so is Manny Pacquiao. So there is no uh, significant increase or decrease to speak of, at least insofar as those candidates are concerned. Again, while this might not seem at face value exciting, what is important to note here is that the fact that there has been no movement over the past 2 months is in itself an interesting result. What has transpired over the past 2 months? So the election campaign period has started. People have candidates. Many candidates have have begun campaign operations, and what we are seeing here, at least insofar as our sample is concerned, is that there is no movement. What does that say? Well, that suggests that in this type of demographic profile, there is little, if any, movement thus far.
So, David, let's move on to the vice presidential race. What are your observations based on the data from our survey?
Sara Duterte maintains her commanding lead in the vice presidential race with a preference share of 54.8%. There is some movement, however, among her rivals. Kiko Pangilinan registered a statistically significant increase from 9.7% in December to 13.7% in mid February. This is largely because of his preference share in the NCR. This places him in a three-way tie with Doc Willie Ong and Tito Soto. While the increase is significant, he still lags far behind Sara Duterte. This is largely due to Sara Duterte's immense popularity in Mindanao, Visayas, and northern and central Luzon. The numbers suggest that Sara Duterte has a firewall in Mindanao, Visayas, and northern and central Luzon that, thus far, prevents other candidates from gaining a beachhead in critical vote-rich regions.
So, between former Senator Marcos and Davao City Mayor Duterte, which do you think is in, I guess, safer spot, considering not only their own numbers but also the numbers of their competitors?
Well, looking at their absolute figures, just looking at their figures, abstracting away from the numbers of their competitors, both are polling above 50%. They are, in fact, statistically significant. So even if you consider Bongbong Marcos at 52.2% and Sara Duterte at 54.8, 55%, this is well within the aforementioned 3% margin of error of our sample. And if you look at their regional group numbers, they have strikingly similar figures in all super regions, particularly in Mindanao, Visayas, and Northern and Central Luzon. So, with that said, both are in very similar positions. Well, of course, abstracting away from their competitors. Now, if you consider their competitors, it would appear that Lenny Robredo is polling better since she is above 20%, at least insofar as her sample is concerned. No vice presidential candidate, apart from Sara Duterte, is above that mark. The three candidates who are at second place are all hovering around the 10-11% mark. So, relatively speaking, it would appear that the presidential race is more competitive. But if you consider the fact that both Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte are polling above 50%, then and nobody is polling at above 30%, then I would place them both in similar positions.
So, would you say at this point that the election campaign is already done? Or is there still room for competitors for both president and vice president to gain enough ground to be competitive when it comes to election day?
So a lot of things can happen, but what I am what I am what but based on what I mentioned earlier, if we consider the past 2 months, because let's face it, we know full well that candidates have long started their campaigns. They have been campaigning well beyond several months now. And if we look at our numbers from December to January to February, and we haven't seen any evidence of movement despite seemingly significant events, at least insofar as public opinion should be concerned. What else can we expect in the coming months? Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, if we consider the decoupling, so to speak, of the ABC and D2E classes, as suggested by the differences in our survey results and those of, say, Lilo and Pulse, then what we can infer here is that while there is no movement in the ABC classes, there is movement in the DE classes. And
Uh,
more to your question, if we consider previous election cycles, the election now shifts to local campaigns in the sense that uh, on the ground campaigns will now become increasingly important, and at the same time, the influence, the power, the importance of local, of key local political figures will now come into play, and that I think would be the next phase of the competition. So apart from competing for votes on a national campaign, whether it be through traditional media and social media, their networks or the capacity of presidential campaigns to tap into local political networks will now play a more pivotal role.
and I think that will especially become more important when the local election campaign period starts.
Correct.
Because at that point, and especially if our alert level, if we go down to alert level 1, let's say, so that will free up a lot of opportunities for house-to-house campaigning and larger rallies. I think that perhaps that what you're saying about the influence of the local leaders will be even more paramount than now.
This is correct.
So, David, based on what we were discussing before, that there has not been so much movement in the survey numbers despite all that has happened in the past few months, related to the election. What do you have to say about the idea that some have raised that perhaps Vice President Robredo's votes share has reached a sort of ceiling?
All candidates have a ceiling, especially given that our present context, our present political context, is 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 intensely polarized. So at the end of the day, if you're looking at a highly polarized and contentious election, there would be anti-X, anti-Y. So there would of course be a ceiling for all candidates. The question then becomes, I think the question then becomes, which side of the fence has a larger share of the population that they can campaign to. If we look at the idea that the coming elections boils down into a question as to whether or not you want to continue uh, the type of governance that was exemplified by the Duterte administration, or you want a break from that. I think that's the critical question that is at the forefront of the minds of many voters. And that in itself determines whether they would vote for a candidate that promises to continue the the policies, advocacies, and governance style of the Duterte administration, or someone who would be entirely different. So, to answer that question, I think a helpful clue would be the approval rating of President Duterte vis-a-vis the approval rating of Vice President Robredo. So that I think is not the answer per se, it is a step towards answering the question. Uh, who are the people who approve of President Duterte? Who are the people who disapprove of President Duterte? What are their shares across the population? And I think that would line up fairly well with how people will vote.
David, what's interesting actually about this campaign and the context that you described is that while President Duterte does have quite high approval and trust ratings still, even at this stage of his presidency, he has still yet to endorse a candidate to succeed him as president. So, how might that affect your analysis from earlier? Because we're saying that we are looking for people would be looking for candidates who would either continue what President Duterte started or would completely oppose what Duterte has started. But in this case, there is no presidential candidate that is really bringing the standard or is serving as the standard bearer of the incumbent administration.
This is where I think the concept of brand affinity is important. It isn't a matter solely of who the president formally endorses, but rather who the people, at least who most people view as his successor, or his uh, or the presidential who would most likely continue or advance his reforms. And a strong argument can be made that that would be former Senator Bongbong Marcos. It also doesn't hurt that he is formally endorsed, strongly I might add, by the president's daughter, Mayor Sara Duterte. So in a way, not only is there this tacit or like underlying similarity between President Duterte and former Senator Bongbong Marcos, whether warranted or not, there is also this overt endorsement of the family. It is also worth mentioning that the siblings of Mayor Sara have endorsed former Senator Bongbong Marcos, if I remember correctly. So there is that sort of relationship. When it comes to, I would think, the power of a presidential endorsement, I would think that we've had a natural experiment, so to speak, uh, that would give us some insight into that question. A few months back, when Senator Bongo was still in the running, we were polling him as well as other firms, and we got the sense of the strength of the president's direct endorsement, given that he, in fact, formally endorsed and accompanied Senate incumbent Senator Bongo in for president.
So, what do you think? Would there be an effect if President Duterte would endorse someone? Or what if, let's say, for example, he would not endorse BBM? He would endorse another candidate for president.
I would think that there would be voters who would take his endorsement, would place a lot of value in his endorsement and switch votes. But at the same time, we have the numbers of Senator Bongo, at least his polling numbers from November to December. We have his numbers as reference points. So that gives you an estimate of how many would switch. And at the same time, going back to the point that what is critical is brand affinity, or how people view a particular candidate vis-a-vis President Rodrigo Duterte. The the candidate that President Duterte endorses, the effect of his endorsement would be, at least in part, influenced by how close or how similar people view that candidate uh, when comparing that candidate to President Duterte.
So, David, now let's move on to our senatorial survey results. What did you find interesting in the data with regards to the Senate race?
So the senatorial survey results of the Pahayag tracker underline the middle class bent of the survey. Points of interest germane to this point include the inclusion of Shell Jokno in the top 12, as well as the relatively lower preference shares of popular personalities such as Rafi Tulfo, Jingoy Estrada, and Robin Padilla, who place much higher in the surveys of other reputable firms. It is also of note that preference shares for senatoriables in the Pahayag tracker are much lower than what is observed in other firms' survey results. It is also of note, another point of interest is that the incumbency advantage of senators seeking re-election, as well as the latent advantages of senators seeking re-election, are still very much present. They are many of the top spots are occupied by senators seeking re-election and senators seeking to return to the Senate. Nevertheless, it can still be said that the race for Senate, at least insofar as the sample is concerned, remains competitive, with 20 or so names polling above the 15% mark, and 12 names competing for four to maybe six of the top 12 spots.
So, David, at this point, based on our senatorial results, like which ranking or at which point in the rankings would you say is like relatively safe going into the May election?
Well, looking at our survey results, the candidates that appear to be safe, at least as far as our sample concerned, are those polling above the 40% mark. Those who can still be viewed to be safe are those polling above the 30% mark. What is happening here is that you we are looking at maybe three or four tiers of competitive candidates, with the top tier occupied by those polling 40% and above. The two tiers. Following that would be those polling 35% and above and those polling 30% above. And then you've got a bunch of other names who are within striking distance of the 30% mark and or can manage to get past that mark in the coming 75 or so days. So going back to your question, I would think that those in the first two tiers, those who are polling above 40% are relatively safe. An argument can be made that those polling above 35% are kind of safe. Uh, and all the other candidates from maybe 15% onwards are still within striking distance of any of the remaining 12 seats for Congress.
So
For
15%.
Senate, for the Senate.
So for the information of our viewers, the 15% vote threshold that David mentioned is at around the 24th place moving upwards. So my question to you, David, is in that tier or that grouping between 13th and 24, who are some names to watch?
So the 13th through 24th ranks have some very interesting names. It is actually populated by returning senators, senators seeking re-election, and popular names. So if you look at 13, at rank 13, you have there Robin Padilla. In 14th place, we have former Senator J.V. Ejercito. And then we have following him is former Quezon City Mayor Bistek Bautista. And then we also have in 16th place former Vice President Jojo Binay. Not to mention former Senator Honasan, Estrada, and Trillanes. They're all in that particular ranking range. So it's highly competitive because these are people with established political bases. They have established track records in campaigning, and I mean they've won elections. So they've demonstrated that they have the capacity to mount effective national campaigns. So this is still shaping up to be a very exciting senatorial race.
What do you think these names in the 13th to 24th place ranking can do to maybe differentiate themselves from the competition and increase their vote shares to make it to the Magic 12 come May?
Well, if it were up to me, I would think that given the time constraint, given that there would be fewer than 80 days left in the elections when this airs, they would need to start thinking more strategically in how they manage their resources, not just their campaign funds, but also the time that they have. I think that's the more critical finite resource. That's the more critical constraint that they are facing. With that kind of constraint, they have to make sure that they get the most bang for their buck. They have to hit the most vote-rich regions. They have to appeal to the broadest demographic basis, and they have to craft messages that appeal to as large as a proportion of people as possible. And I think that in order for a candidate to differentiate himself or herself from the rest of the field, they should offer something that the majority of people want. Now, based on our discussion earlier, a huge factor, I think, is whether or not they would challenge or support the continuation of the Duterte administration. I think that many voters are viewing this election in that lens, and that, of course, extends to how they choose their senators. The question then becomes, would this senator support or oppose the continuation of the policies, programs, and advocacies of the Duterte administration? And a person's or a voter's answer to that question will have a strong effect on his or her slate. So that's another factor that candidates should consider in the remaining days of the campaign.
But at the same time, David, we've seen in our survey the juxtaposition between the high rankings of the uni team and also the higher rankings, even compared to other surveys of prominent opposition figures, like, for example, Attorney Chel Diokno or Senator Risa Hontiveros. So, how could we reconcile those two findings, which appear to contradict themselves?
I would argue that you can have um, a more heterogeneous mixture in your Senate slate, given that you're given 12 options. So people still have the freedom to mix and match depending on how they view certain personalities. So they the catch is that you can only vote for one presidential candidate. You can only vote for one vice presidential candidate. But you have considerably more leeway when it comes to picking out your Senate slate. So with that in mind, you can have a more heady mix, so to speak, when it comes to filling out your senatorial polls.
Well, David, thank you again for joining us to provide more insights on our Feb 11 to 16 survey. And we look forward to talking to you again on the next episode for our next surveys.
All right, happy to be here, and I'll see you next month.
For PUBLiCUS Asia Incorporated, I'm Morelli Sinsuat, and this was the Pahayag Election Report, where we report the state of the race for President, Vice President, and Senator in the upcoming May 2022 elections. For more information on the elections and to follow our other activities, please hit the subscribe button here on our YouTube channel and also like us on Facebook at PUBLiCUS Asia Incorporated. We'll see you again for our next survey results, which will be coming out soon. Thank you and have a great day.